Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves.
Hey there, everybody. It's Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast. And today we are interviewing Diane Halfman, which is a pretty crazy story. We met through a mutual friend, and Diane works with business leaders who are kind of having problems second guessing themselves, kind of stepping into their power, like understanding that they can be authentically them. And when she told me her backstory, I'm like, oh, that's funny. How did you get into that business? She's like, well, I used to pose as a prostitute as an undercover cop and put myself in very dangerous situations. And when you're there, you kind of have to step into your power and be really confident about yourself. So Diane, welcome to the show. And, I know you kind of have a heart out because you are a busy lady, but why don't you just tell us your backstory? Give us the Reader's Digest version about how you come to be and this craziness, which is now training entrepreneurs and stepping up.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's so great to be here and talking with your audience. It's interesting. I think if everybody looks at their journey and just their experiences and what they've done, a lot of times it seems unlikely of the things that we do, but we all wear like a lot of different hats. I mean, I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be a police officer, and not only being a police officer who answered 911 calls and been in thousands of homes, but to work, as you mentioned, as an undercover prostitute. We were hunting a serial killer. I didn't grow up knowing how to do that, right?
Yeah.
Even in the police academy, we didn't really talk about things like that. It's like the on-the-job training of things that we learn that help us develop our skills. And, when you don't have the tools that you normally have as a police officer when you work undercover. So I didn't have my bulletproof vest. I didn't have my gun. I didn't have my radio. And I wasn't wearing a lot of clothes, right? So there's a lot of things you have to adapt to and really start trusting yourself. And that's really the distinction that I started looking at when I retired from the department, because, I actually didn't think I was going to share with very many people after I retired that I was a police officer. It was like, okay, that was a part of my life. It's behind. But when people found out about it, they would always, first of all, want to hear about the stories, especially the undercover stories. And they would want to know, like, how did you do that job? And what did it look like? And so when I started talking about it, one of the things I realized is that, we all learn and have like knowledge and information, but in critical situations, you have to trust on your own power, your own knowing, and you have to be able to act on them in immediate moments. So I was able to really build the skills around having situational awareness, making quick decisions, not second guessing myself, and to really make the best decision in very quick moments, right? I had seconds to make decisions, especially when we were looking for a serial killer, when cars would go by and how I would talk to them and the amount of information and who else was in the area was really important. And, those same skills apply to business and life. Like when you're in it, you have to be able to make a decision. Now, it's not always life and death, and you don't have to, always make it right in that moment. But there are times when we have to make critical decisions, and we have to be able to know what are our values or foundations or what is the basis that we're actually making those decisions from, so that we can make them quicker and that we can trust them. Because one of the things I found with a lot of business leaders is that they can make decisions, and sometimes they can make even quick decisions, but the internal dialogue that happens about second guessing them and should I have done this and doing it differently and how's it going to affect my clients or my staff or the people I work with. And so there's all of that internal dialogue that comes along with that decision making.
I want to go back a little bit to the origin story. So you sign up for the police department, you're doing your thing. How does it come to be that somebody approaches you and be like, hey, you know what we think you'd be great at? Undercover work. You know what we think you'd be great at is wearing fewer clothes. Like, is that an awkward conversation or what?
It's wild because, I was the only woman on my squad for many years. Back then, there wasn't a lot of women on the department. So it kind of came down to eeny, meeny, miny, mo. It's going to be me or Joe, so who's going to be doing that work? And, and the situation is, we were coming off of, there was a renowned serial killer, the Green River Killer, who had killed 70 women over a span of 10 years. And serial killers have very distinct ways of how they kill people. And I believe like 20 of them happened in San Diego, which is the area that I worked. And what happens often is that there are copycat serial killers that start happening, and we started having that in our area. So it was very important for us to, really focus on identifying people in the area, making sure that that wasn't expanding and that, people were being safe. Because, a lot of the questions that we get is like, well, why are you focusing on prostitution? That's a victimless crime. Why are you not working on murder? Well, people don't realize that those things are all related.
Right.
And the things that are attracted to that area, and when you work in vice and in the whole prostitution, you've got people who connect with them, who do business with them, that are doing other criminal activities. So whether it's money laundering or, child trafficking, sometimes, robbery. And so when we do details of arresting people for prostitution, we're able to put them at a time and place so that if a, robbery or murder or something happens within a couple blocks, we can definitively say that they were in the area and that they were there. So our whole objective in that undercover assignment was to arrest as many men as we could a night to be able to put them in a certain place. So I would arrest like 34 men a night to be able and, to build this bank of knowledge that allowed us to, it was actually through undercover prostitution that the Green River killer was actually killed, because he was actually stopped twice during this time of his series, and we're able to connect him with DNA and with crime. So there's a lot of method to the madness when it comes to undercover work and how many things that you can solve. Because if you can solve people that do serial, either like a serial robber or a rapist or a murderer, then you are taking out massive amounts of crime that just one person does.
It's so funny. There's so many different directions I would love to go here. Now I'm mad that we don't have 5 hours, because I have an ex-girlfriend who's one of the strongest women I've ever met, and she's a detective for LAPD. And we've had these conversations where it's like the libertarian in me says, well, yeah, prostitution, drugs, it's your body, do whatever you want. But then when you go one step deeper and you're like the human trafficking, the abuse, the to your point, the crime that is all interwoven into this world. It's like some libertarians will say, well, just make it totally legal and all that goes away. And then some people who are more realistic and a little bit more probably right leaning like myself is like, no, it doesn't go away. Like the human trafficking is there. The abuse side of it is there. So it's a really fundamentally hard issue for libertarians to think through, because I want people to do whatever they want to do. But I also realize, to what you're saying, is like you arrest 30 guys a night for prostitution. Oh, it also turns out 10 of them are beating their wife and 4 of them are trafficking drugs and 2 of them are trafficking humans. Like, that's a real problem.
Right. Yeah. It always goes deeper than the surface. And it's like everything in life.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you and I spoke briefly before we jumped on. You talked about, this idea of a lot of people giving up their freedom and liberty, and some things just kind of sliding into chaos. And maybe you have an opinion about this and maybe you don't. My opinion is that, especially in LA County, San Francisco, where they've now effectively decriminalized the smaller stuff. If you steal something under $1,000, they're not going to prosecute you. And if you're trespassing, they're not going to prosecute you. And they're basically telling the police force, like, don't bother with any of these low-lying crimes. Having worked in that area for a large percentage of your life, do you see a correlation of those people who, steal a case of beer, escalate to this, escalate to that, escalate to this, eventually become career criminals? Or is like our district attorney here in Los Angeles, in your opinion, on the right track, where he's like, hey, let's not incarcerate all these people for petty crimes and let's go after the big stuff? Or does the little stuff become the big stuff in your police experience?
Yeah, in my opinion, the little stuff becomes the big stuff. And when I say little stuff, when they say, petty crime, it's up to $1,000. Now, if you're a small business owner and you've got people who go, hey, you can't touch me, I'm going to come in and shoplift in your place every day and I'm going to get a ticket for it, that affects your business, right? And that is your economy. And this is where we're talking about, what are your rights and your freedoms. And I think one of the things that we've gotten away from is people to really understand, like, what are their constitutional rights, and what is it that government is actually here to do. And I think so many times we rely on government to make our decisions for us versus us knowing what are our values, how do we want to interact with other human beings. And actually the bottom line of the Constitution is that government is here to secure our rights. And if you don't know what your rights are and they're not being protected, then we have a problem. And one of the things that we've noticed happening is, it's interesting in the times that are going on, when you start looking at the bigger picture, why is it that small businesses are closing, right? Why is it that, the middle class is staying home, and, there's people who are, even the things like wearing a mask, like, it's not a matter of right, left, right, wrong kind of thing. It's really about how, are you actually able to come to those conclusions to yourself? We look at TV, it's called programming, right? It's programming for a reason. It's like telling you what it is that you are to believe. And we're getting away from our personal freedoms, which allow us to be at liberty, to be able to be at choice about what it is that we do and what that actually looks like in our life. And so if you start looking at some of the propaganda and the words and things that are happening, it's like, there's a division that's happening, right? And it's having where people feel like they have to take sides. And, the mask issue is a perfect example. And, if somebody feels comfortable, they've done their own research and they want to wear a mask, great, but for people who aren't wearing a mask, there's a lot of opinions around that. Like, well, you're going to kill grandma, or you're not looking at the greater good, or that's being selfish. But people aren't looking at, well, when you wear a mask for 8 hours a day, you're cutting off your oxygen, which means you can't think very clearly. And there's higher cases of people getting respiratory diseases because they're breathing their own toxins. So what happens is that when we start looking outside of ourselves and we start giving our power away, and we're looking at whether it's government outreach or, our politicians or, even teachers and bosses, where we're believing everything that they say is for our good without us evaluating it ourselves. I'm sure there's plenty of people on both sides of it who have their own opinion on it and actually feel strongly about it, but they're not listening to their own common sense and their own knowledge. They're abdicating their power for someone to make a decision for them. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. And it goes against our principles of having freedom. I mean, freedom is being at liberty to choose what it is that you do. And so it's a bigger thing to look at. But, we actually have more things in common than not. And so if you look at all the things where people are trying to divide us in a lot of different ways and to make, well, if you feel a certain way, then you're wrong, right? Well, what happened to you could just share your opinion and take the good points, because there's always good and bad in everything. And you want to look at all of it and then digest that and make a decision for yourself, because you want to be an autonomous, independent person. And when we abdicate that and we look for like, well, I think the government should tell me how I'm going to breathe, or if I'm in my house or out of my house, or how I should run my health. And, even experts and scientists and researchers, and anybody can find any kind of information that can support their side, right? Because we know that most research and scientists they happen to support whatever, that product is, or whatever.
Right, wherever they're getting their funding.
Right. So you have to go follow the money. Like, who's actually funding something, who's benefiting from this? Like, look at the bigger picture and don't just take things at face value. And that's where the investigative qualities, and I think that's what I bring in as far as, being a police officer, is ask more questions. Like, don't just accept something straight up the way it is, especially if in yourself you're like, I don't really agree with that, but the government tells me to do it, so I'm going to do it. Yeah. Right? That's not fun. That's not American values. It's not you knowing what is best for you and your family. And because you stand up for yourself, it's interesting some of the rhetoric that's coming up of saying like, oh, you're not looking out for the greater society, or you're being selfish, or like, that's not true. They're not mutually exclusive. That is just language that pits people aside from each other. And, all the different censoring that's happening with people even sharing their opinion. Since when is somebody saying, how they feel about something, wrong? Right. It's just like, why can't you just like do your own research and find out what's best for you and your family? It's not that you are, it's so funny to me that there's so many things coming up now that by you standing for your own personal freedoms that you're somehow hurting society, and it's very warped in that way, as I believe. And I think that it's a slippery slope when people start giving away too much of their freedoms and their rights without actually knowing what's behind them and what is on the other side of that when they do that, because at some point you end up not having an opinion and you're not standing for yourself and you're abdicating your life. You're not living the life that you chose to live for yourself.
You said a couple things in there where I'm also struggling with balancing these couple ideas. It's like, there's two things that are really powerful that you said at the beginning, like trust your instincts, trust your gut, and also ask good questions, right? And it's like all of us have to come up with a balance at some point of like, hey, I'm trying to do the research, I'm asking the questions, I'm reading the articles. And eventually at some point you just have to go with your gut, And so trying to balance those two ideas, because I think about my mom worked at Rite Aid in the pharmacy for years, like the clerk at the pharmacy. She wasn't a pharmacist. And everybody knew when you start working in the pharmacy for the first couple years, you're going to be sick all the time because you're coming in contact with sick people. And, we know this about preschool teachers. Preschool teachers are in a cesspool of little children disease. So the first couple years, they're going to have a lot of colds and flus and whatnot. But it's like, okay, you breathe it in, you get over it. There's a natural immunity. And if I'm just kind of thinking with my gut, I'm like, the masks just don't make any sense. But I also want to ask questions and I don't want to kill grandma. And eventually everybody comes to their own decision. And I don't know why that's being so vilified. I think that's the right word.
Right.
Why, it feels like to me, the people that want to vilify another group of people are the ones that are constantly asking questions. And I'm just like, hey, but deep down inside, this is silly, right? Like deep down inside, your 5-year-old who has a 0.000001 chance of dying from COVID, this is kind of silly. Like if you text and drive or let your kids swim in the pool or eat hot dogs, there's a greater chance they're going to die of any of those things than like not wearing a mask. And so just, trying to balance this idea. And I'm sure this is something you teach in leadership is like, get the facts, ask the questions, analyze, but eventually as a leader, you got to go with your gut and you have to make a decision. Like you're in charge, right? I mean, how do you balance those two kind of competing theories of like analysis paralysis, which can lead you down one path versus going with your gut that can lead you down another path. And both of them can be fulfilling or dangerous.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I think what happens is that, you do the research, right? You look at, okay, what's being said here? What's the reality? What am I experiencing? Right. Because there's an interesting thing that happens where, and I used to experience this on the police department, what's the role of media, right? It's sensationalism. It's to have you watch more. It's like to catch the cliffhanger before the commercial so that you listen to the story. It's like more, blood and guts will, get people in and the fear, right? And so there's a propaganda of fear. And when people are in fear, they listen to things sometimes from an irrational standpoint. Like I can remember being on scenes and I would go home and I, would turn on the news and I would hear their reporting of that crime or that scene or something that happened. And there would be clips and pieces of what happened. And it literally was not what happened. I was there. And so, people at home don't necessarily know that, right? They believe everything that they're being told as if that's the facts, as if that's what happened there. And so, there has to be some discernment. And one of the things that you said in terms of, like your immunity, like when you come down to like your health, right? People forget that, our body is an amazing thing and it can, usually they say with any type of like cold or something, your body will move through this 2 to 3 week cycle where he knows how to heal itself if you do the things to build your immunity and have the things that work with it. People forget that we actually are viruses. We are bacteria. We have 10 times more bacterial cells within our body than human cells. We are actually meant to be exposed to things so that we can build that immunity and that we can cycle through them. I find it very interesting. And I'm not saying that people aren't getting sick because people get sick and die every day. It's almost as if people forgot that people die of the flu. They die of influenza. But all of a sudden, we don't have those diseases anymore and we just have COVID. very interesting. So you really want to look at, and if we had a true pandemic that was happening right now, people would be falling in the street and you wouldn't have to convince or give someone a donut to have, a shot. They would be wanting to have it because they could see what's actually happening. That's not happening. Like, that's not what's going on. And the whole thing about, hospitals that, they're at capacity and ICU is full. Well, what's their capacity? A lot of them have changed their capacity where it's 3 rooms, right? So you look at what is the data you're getting, what's the reality of what's happening, what are people being exposed to? I'm not saying that people aren't getting, this illness, that this is what they're calling it, but, has the question's been asked of how have they determined that, right? When there's variants, a lot of people are researchers are saying variants are actually from, backs injuries, right? There's a lot to impact with all of this. And for someone to say, I've got all the answers, what's that based on and what does that look like? And so you have to look at what have you done for your own immunity? Because, you notice you've had, people can be in a room and be around people who are sick and that person doesn't get sick, right? And the other people do. And you look at the difference of that is what's the strength of their immunity. Mm-hmm. And so there are things that we can do. And there's a reason that, with doctors, they call it, practicing medicine because they haven't figured it out. And that's why, I belong to a health group where people have committed to being their own doctor, to actually know how their body works and have and build that immunity. And so, we don't do sickness. Like, we know how the body works. And so when people abdicate their health, that's just another area of their life that they're expecting somebody else to figure it out. And I find it interesting that the, answer for a lot of people is doing things that don't increase their health. Why aren't people going door to door and saying, how about have exercise, have better eating habits, eat better? People know what are the habits to have when, you look at being a healthy person, and to all of a sudden go like, oh my God, this person got sick from this. Well, what was their condition of their health? Like, what have they done? Like, it didn't just overnight they become a sick person. Like, there are certain, personal responsibilities that people have to say is like, oh, well, I smoked for 20 years, or I never went for a walk, or I only ate fast food, right? There's some responsibility that has to happen for people to, if you want to have the freedom and live the life you want to live, you have to make certain choices that you're making healthy choices and you're doing that. And that, it ripples to all the different areas of your life of, really understanding what are your values, what do you stand for, what's true for you, and to be able to have some real conversations with people. You and I both know if we were on one of the social media platforms and we were having a real deep conversation around this, it'd probably be censored. Yeah. Right. And why? Right. Just because we're having the conversation and we're bringing up questions that allow people to be independent thinkers to really look at some things, you're going to have, and I guarantee you there's going to be some people who'll be like, I think I'm going to start asking myself some questions and start seeing, okay, what's going on here for me and for my family, and what are some of those decisions I need to make? And there's other people going to be like, oh, you're going to kill grandma, or you're not trying to protect the whole society type thing. And they're not the same conversation. And because I'm talking from, my own personal experience, and, I've done my research and I know what I do for my family, it doesn't mean that other people's decision is wrong or bad. It's just like, okay, if this is the decision you're making for your family, I would just like to know, what questions did you ask? Like, a lot of people will do certain things and they don't even know what is in a certain product or how it affects their body or what may happen. And, those are all things that you need to make decisions on, but you want to make it because you did your own personal research and you looked at it, not because you were fearful or you felt forced or you were going to lose your job, or, you really have to come down to these questions of, whose life are you leading anyway?
Yeah, it's interesting. Something I saw Bill Maher talking about the other day on Jimmy Kimmel, and it was a very uncomfortable conversation because Bill Maher was speaking truth, as that's such a popular thing to say now. And Jimmy Kimmel was making these super uncomfortable laughs because he knew he was part of the apparatus that was being insulted. And Bill Maher, I'm going to get some of the numbers wrong, so this is where we'll get fact checked and kicked off of YouTube. But something to the effect of, like, Bill Maher was saying, hey, there's a certain group of people that when surveyed, they thought the chances of hospitalization if you got COVID were around 40%. when the real number is like 0.4 to 1.4%. So somewhere on a magnitude of, 40 to 100 times greater belief that you are going to get hospitalized if you get something. And again, I don't want to diminish from the tragedy that has been COVID and people that have legitimately lost people, again, tragically or prematurely because of COVID, because that's absolutely happened. But this idea that, to your point, TV is all programming and it's the cliffhanger of the news trying to get you to hang on for 3 more seconds so they can sell one more Viagra ad. It's like, well, yeah, of course they're going to scare the shit out of you. And it's not surprising that if you're not asking the right questions or doing the research yourself, you would think at a magnitude of 100 times greater than it actually is that you're going to get hospitalized if you get COVID. And when I heard that stat, I was like, oh yeah, that just shows how much the media, quote unquote, left, right, center, doesn't matter, how much the media is into just pushing fear porn. And it's so sad. Because there's a lot of life to live. I want to circle this back around to your leadership training because, I can't imagine being the CEO or the leader of a big company. I have a close personal relationship with our CEO. He has like 4,000 employees, and it doesn't matter what he says right now on back to work, work from home. You should get a vaccine. You shouldn't get a vaccine. We're going to support the Biden policy. We're not going to support the Biden. It doesn't matter what he say. He is going to viciously offend half of his employees. Like, this issue is so divided. How can leaders approach this right now if they're like, hey, I got to lead a group of people. I don't want 50% of my employees to feel ostracized or walk out on me. But, we've got to make some business decisions. Do we fight this new Biden mandate where employees or companies over 100 employees have to get vaccinated? Or do we acquiesce? Or do we do this? Or do we just making these really tough decisions in a segmented society where 50% of your employees are probably more left leaning and 50% are more right leaning? That's a tough order for a leader. So how do they do it?
Well, I think, first of all, and I know this is really challenging for people to take politics out of it. It's not really a right-left issue because there's plenty of, shenanigans going on both sides, right?
100%.
I think that is something that divides us to be like, oh, are you right or are you left? Well, who cares, right? That ultimately, that doesn't really matter. It comes down to, why are businesses being forced to make decisions about people's personal health? That's government, overreach. I mean, here it is. We are supposed to, as I mentioned before, the whole purpose of government, which is, we the people, right? We're supposed to have government that reflects how we want to live our life. They are here to secure our rights. Our rights are inalienable rights from God, where we are able to have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When someone says you have to do this particular thing, that has taken that away. That's taken away that personal freedom. So as a business owner, you in essence have to have the strength and the courage to say, I trust my people enough to make that decision for themselves and their family themselves. I am not going to force them to do something that, one, is experimental, that we have no idea what some of the side effects are. We know that there's some suppression of people who have died from those kind of things. You can be held responsible on either side, right? There's legal things that are set up down the road. Why is it that the government's trying to push private businesses to make those decisions? Because they know, as a government entity, they can't do that because it's against our rights. And so for a business person to, in essence, back themselves in the corner in a political conundrum that they are actually going to held liable down the road, what happens if someone has adverse reactions and then you get sued? Right. And, people will say, well, the opposite can be true, where you can get sick or things can happen. But people are forgetting, this is a human body. You are going to get sick if you don't take care of it. Right. There are things that you can do to protect yourself from that. People can have choices where it's like, okay, if you don't feel comfortable being in, connecting with humans and being together, you can work from home. There can be options with that, but you let people make those decisions from themselves. I mean, I think it's a very scary position when the government gets to tell you what you put in your body, how you're going to run your business, and what that looks like from a day to day. That's not being a leader. That is being a follower. And that is you not standing up for the type of life you want to live. And what are the values that your company stands for? Like, are you in integrity? Do you stand for your people? Do you, who is it that you decide, you're in essence playing God with how someone's going to live their life and what that is going to look like. And I think that's why we're starting to see a lot more of the whistleblowing videos of people who are like, hey, this person was forced and they died, right? More people are dying from that than anything else. And that's where the skewing of statistics start happening. And I think that that's another slippery slope is when, because you can have statistics on both sides for anything. But I think it comes down to the fundamental overreaching of people being able to make decisions about their health for themselves.
Yeah, it's funny. I was kind of trying to think through this because I'm sympathetic to people that are in leadership positions right now. I'm like, all right, let me do this thought experiment. Let's say I could wave a magic wand and know for certain that the vaccine works with 100% efficacy. There's no negative side effects. Basically, it's the most rose-colored painting or rose-colored glasses that you can see this through. Everything is perfect. Okay, I still don't want to live in a society where the government can have your business force you to take anything. Even if everything is safe and there's no adverse outcomes, and we know that, if we knew that the vaccine means you couldn't get it, you couldn't transmit it, it was 100% safe, even if all of those things were to be true, I still don't want to live in a society where government or my employer can tell me, hey, this is what you do, this is what you can't do. It's like, it would be awkward if my boss could tell me to wear a condom or not. Like, that's kind of a personal choice. It's like, I could get a disease. I could get a disease by not wearing a condom, but that doesn't mean my CEO gets to call me and be like, hey man, it's Saturday night. Are you strapping up? Like that would be awkward.
Right. Well, and what happened to HIPAA where you actually had privacy around your health? And it's interesting now. It's like you can walk into a grocery store and people will be like, did you get, the shot? Are you wearing a mask? It's like, who are you? Like, are you my doctor? Are you like somebody who's going to have this conversation with me? It's wild, the overreaching and overstepping that people feel. In fact, I actually had a friend that somebody in the grocery store was actually doing that. And she looked in this person's cart and she started like pulling out like their Coca-Cola and their chips and all that. And oh, what are you doing? Oh, well, if you're going to, dictate my health, I'm going to help you dictate your health because these aren't healthy things for you. It's like, where do you draw the line on, what is good for your health, and who are you to tell someone how to run their health and what that looks like? And, the whole foundation of America was leaving an oppressed, a king realm royalty telling you how to live your life to have, independence. It's like the Declaration of Independence, that you independently get to decide how you live your life. And, it's like the more of these things that you are looking for the government to make these decisions for you, at some point, you don't get to make any decisions. And that far-reaching aspect of you can't get into a grocery store and travel and you can't get into a school. I mean, it's like there's so many different, things that if people don't look several, things down the road, and this is what a leader really needs to do, is what is the impact of their decisions? What happens with those kind of things? And you have to look at several steps down the road of what is that ultimate impact? And, I just think the bottom line comes down to is it the government's place to be in personal, private business to tell them how to run it? Like, are they going to next tell you like what you should focus on the next quarter, or how you should budget your money, or what things look like? It's like, who's running the business?
Right.
You get to make those decisions.
I do want to circle back to some leadership questions in the short time that we have, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask. So did you guys catch the serial killer, going back to your days of, working the streets and try to categorize people? So how does that story end?
Yes, absolutely. We did. And the greater one, the bigger one, the Green River, there was a task force that had multiple agencies. And although I wasn't personally in that, it was through undercover prostitution that he was actually connected to the crimes and arrested for that. So those, anytime that we've done, undercover prostitution, it has always led to other type of arrests and other type of connections to greater crimes.
That's awesome. So when it comes to leadership, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, this idea of like, okay, well, I'm going in unarmed, as it was, no gun, no bulletproof vest, no radio, no baton, just kind of your wits. that I imagine with some creepy dudes, one of which might be a serial killer, your situational awareness, as you mentioned, has to be just like on a level 200 out of 1 to 10, right? Because obviously you don't want to get killed in these situations. Tell me about honing that situational awareness without putting myself in a situation where I could get killed by a serial killer, and why that's so important to people that want to become leaders or are leaders. Like how do you hone that situational awareness without putting yourself in a dangerous situation in the normal day-to-day, and why is that important to business?
So great. Such a great question. Because what happens is that, people walk through like a room, the people that they work with and just in life in general. And they're so focused most of the time on their internal conversations. And a lot of times when people have a conversation, what are they doing? They're waiting to talk, right? And they're missing cues, whether they're verbal or nonverbal, of what's happening around them. Part of being able to increase your situational awareness is to have like moments of silence where you are really looking at the room, right? You are seeing who's in the room, who's interacting with who, what are some of the things that they are doing. And even on things like Zoom, like you can really kind of look and see, like, is someone paying attention to what's going on? Are they distracted? Like, what are some of the things that they're bringing up? Like, what's going on? And that's why it's great when you've got leaders that when they do come in contact with people, they'd be like, hey, how you doing? And if they go, oh, fine, maybe ask a little bit deeper question without, prying or becoming personal. It depends on the relationship that you've built with them. And that is something that happens, is that when you've built relationships with people, when they're off on something or something is working or not working. And you also have to be able to give your team the tools to have the conversation. How do they de-escalate situations, right? What does their come from? Do they, you can only imagine now with just the things that we've talked about here, with some people having the conversation, whether they agree or not agree, that can escalate into fights and division, and it can affect work. And there's a lot of things that can happen with that. So you have to be able to look at, okay, who are your people? What are the things that they're struggling with? What do they stand for? How can you support them? And when you have a good idea of who's in the room and how you're interacting with them, you then know when things are off, and you can be more pinpointing about what's happening, and you can be that a step ahead of when things come up, of how to minimize them, and how to let people have their voice and let them make the decisions that they need to happen. A lot of times people look at a leader of that is a dictator, right? And that there's controlling, and it's like, you do this and you're doing that. That's more of a manager. If you're a leader, you are bringing out the strengths and qualities and experiences of your people, and leading them to excel in those and to show up in those. And when you are building team, and this is where team leadership really works, is to actually encourage the differences of other people, and to actually have some questions that maybe are polarizing, that you can actually point out what are the good points of them bringing that up, right? People who are following a lot of things that are happening right now, it's maybe because they're scared, or, they want to, they feel like they're doing the safest thing, right? So they're trying to be risk adverse, right? There are some good qualities that are in that. And so you want to look at what is the discussions on both sides, so that people feel heard. When people feel heard, then they can actually kind of calm down any of the things that are happening. And it's not about people, being right or wrong. It's about being heard, right? And being able to say, okay, I had some impact in what's happening here. So when you're aware of your people and your environment and what your business is here to do, you as the leader, you're to be more of the visionary, where you oversee what's going on. You're not necessarily the implementer of the things that are happening. You need to be able to see, okay, where are we having a rock thrown out of nowhere? What's going on? What's happening at the overall picture? And to make sure that your people have the skills to be able to maneuver through things like this. I mean, this is a time where, so much of the conversation is focused on, the disease, but not looking at the ramifications of people who've been locked in their home for almost 2 years, where the suicide's been up, domestic violence been up, child abuse has been up. There's a lot of things that people are dealing with on a mental, emotional way, that as a leader, you have to be aware of what people's situations are, because, it affects everything.
You know, it's interesting. I read a very logical news article, and what was beautiful is I couldn't even tell if the person was left leaning or right leaning or pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. All he was arguing was that our leaders, Trump, Biden, whoever, have failed us because, okay, in the first 3 to 4 months of the disease, totally makes sense that we relinquish almost all control to like the experts, right? And the scientists and the Fauci types and whatnot. But once we have a handle on what the disease is, you know, they had the genome mapped pretty quickly. He goes, where leadership has failed us, and it's exactly what you're saying, is now the people making the decisions should be a panel of virologists and economists and social workers and drug abuse experts. He's like, because this isn't just one thing. This isn't just one silo of the disease, the virus, the disease, the virus. There's second and third order effects of like drug abuse is up, child abuse is up, suicides are up. So it's like, if we had good leaders at the government level, which unfortunately both parties have failed at that, in my humble opinion, if we had good leaders at the federal level and we had politicians that were following through, somebody should pivot and be asking better questions and be listening to a larger panel of experts, where it's like, at this point now, we need to hear from some of the economists and we need to hear from some of the, you know, child experts. Is there more harm than good coming in by keeping a 5-year-old in a mask for 8 hours a day? And it just feels like if you try to have any of those questions or have any of those discussions, you're labeled as a bad guy or you're censored or whatnot. And I'm like, I'm trying to figure out, and you alluded to this as what it makes to me a good leader. Why is it so difficult or damning, or some people would even say violent, to listen to an opposing point of view? It's like you're just gathering data, and I don't know why that's such a bitter disconnect in our country right now, especially with our leaders who don't seem to want to listen to anybody on the other side of the aisle or anybody with a different opinion. It's like, who can get in their 2-minute talking point as fast as possible?
Right. Well, but those are great questions to ask. And those are the kind of questions that we need to ask ourselves is, why is it that no other opinions are being allowed to be aired? Like, why is there so much censorship that's happening? What are they so afraid of to hear of that goes against, you know, it's hard to not say that this isn't a pandemic or that there's an agenda, or it's like, it feels like no matter what's happening, you know, it's like this, if you get the shot, then everything will be fine. Well, statistics show that that's not true. Like, that's not happening. And so, you know, you do need to have a wider panel of people and experts to look at that, because, you know, it's not just a matter like you hear on one side, people be like, well, just wear the damn mask. Like, everything would be fine if that happened, right? And then you got other people who are like, okay, there are some serious health issues by blocking your oxygen all day long. There's things with children in facial recognition in learning. And, you know, masks were actually used as a tool for slavery, for submission, for people not to be seen and to get away from being recognized as an independent being. So there's a lot of psychological things for a long-term use of this. It was never meant to be meant for this from a logical standpoint in looking at it. And, you know, there's many things that can be argued on either side of it, but you have to hear all of it, right? You have to have all of it. If you just hear one side all the time, you're going to make decisions based on this is all you've heard. But until you hear the full totality of it, it's like in a business. Like, you wouldn't be in a business meeting and you had two people that were representing two aspects of your business and you only listened to this side of it, right? And you didn't listen to the customer service or the follow-up or the quality, right? You're just listening to production and you weren't listening to quality. But now all of a sudden you've got a product that's falling apart and, you know, you're losing money because you didn't listen to the other aspect of it. You wouldn't do that in business.
Right.
You wouldn't do it in your family where it's like, I'm only going to listen to, you know, my spouse, the positive things that they say, right? Or the fear things that they say, and I'm not going to listen to anything else. I mean, that takes away our ability to have dialogue and conversation and to look at, okay, what are the questions we're asking? What are the questions we're not asking? And what are we afraid to talk about because, you know, we're going to be jumped on because there's now this piling opinion of you're right, you're wrong. And that just divides us more, right? If we start asking questions more like, how are we more alike? What are the things that we all want to have happen? We want to be healthy, right? We want to be happy. We want to be able to pursue life the way we want to be able to do it. We want to be able to have the freedoms to live it in the way we want to do it. Like, who ever said that, you know, there's one way to live life and everyone should do it this way? That goes against our principles of who we stand for as Americans. And, you know, it's just really interesting the interpretations of if somebody says something and they automatically feel that it goes against what they've heard or what they've decided, they don't listen to what that person has to say. What if you thought that what they said was like 90% you didn't believe it, but there was something in there that was for you to hear, right? And that was the thing that you needed to help make a decision on things. I want all the facts. Like I want to have all the information to have. I don't want to have just one source telling me, because if anything, that brings up my spidey senses even more of like, why is someone pushing me to believe something so hard that they're going to give me free flight tickets or they're going to give me all these things? If there's like a true issue, it should be obvious that there's a true issue, right? And that's not obvious. It's not happening that way. And so I think that people just need to make more questions. And whether you're the leader of your company or your family, or, you know, you're leading the charge in whatever you're here to do in your life, just make sure that you are checking in with your internal knowing. Like if something doesn't feel right, research more, ask other people, ask different, you know, sides of things. Like, how come you're making a decision to do things in this way? You know, and then ask somebody else who's doing something completely different. Why are you doing it in this way, right? And that's an actual gathering of information so that you can assimilate it and go, okay, how does this line up with my personal values? What do I want for my family? What's the kind of life I want to live? How can I make the best contribution? And making a decision from that point, because how is it that your way of being, your, you know, knowingness is, you know, any less than anybody else? And I think the lie that's happening out there is that there's other people, whether it's government, politicians, you know, business owners, whoever, that they know more about how you should live your life than you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not okay with that.
No, I totally agree. And a good friend of mine who we're good friends and we probably disagree on every single thing you can possibly imagine politically. You know, we'll exchange books. I'll make him read something super right-leaning, libertarian, almost anarchist, and he'll make me read something that's like, you know, anti-Trump, anti-conservative, pro-liberal, whatever the case may be. And I read a book that he recommended called The Death of Expertise. And it was really interesting because in the book, he was trying to argue that like, there is this problem in America where because you can go to WebMD and try to research your own disease, that there's a diminished trust in, you know, people that spent 10 years becoming doctors and trying to help you facilitate that conversation. And it was interesting because as I was reading it, I was back to this idea of like asking the questions but trusting your gut. It's like, I don't want to be the conspiracy theorist who's like, just crazy in my 50s and doesn't trust anybody and doesn't think anybody who has expertise is worth their opinion, because there's people that have specialized knowledge that I'll never be able to obtain. You know, when I go to the automotive shop, I just assume that they actually changed my oil. I don't know if they actually changed my oil, but there's a certain level of expertise that I trust that they're doing the right thing and I'm paying them for that service. But I do feel like the pendulum has swung maybe a little too far in the direction of trusting the science. I feel like anytime somebody puts the word "the" in front of it, it's like, what are you trying to convince me of? Because science is this ongoing questioning and exploration. Right. And if you're just saying the science, that feels very much like believe in the God or my God. Right. And I'm not a very religious person.
Who paid for the science? Who paid for it?
Right. So I want to balance those two thoughts. I don't want to be a crazy skeptic who turns myself into having like, you know, onslaught or induced psychosis, or I don't want to become schizophrenic because I don't trust anybody, but I also don't want to just trust blindly. And, you know, I think to your point, that's kind of what a leader has to do, is eventually they have to stand in their own power and lead from their own direction. And the people that follow them are going to have to deal with the ramifications one way or another. So I know you have a hard out here, and I always like to end with this question because I have a friend, John Vroman, who's great at asking questions. What's the question I forgot to ask, or the thing that you always wish you have a chance to get to on these podcasts, or the stories that you get that you wish you had time to tell? Like my buddy John Vroman, to your point about asking great questions, he always asks, instead of, hey, how are you doing? Then you just get the generic answer. He's like, hey, Scott, what's going well in your life right now? And I'm like, I know what you're doing. You're just going a level deeper with some tricky question, but I also like it. So what's the question you wish we would have asked, or the story you wish you could have told in the last hour that we missed on?
Well, I would think that, you know, it's interesting because I feel like we've really covered, you know, a big segment of what we want to do and what we're talking about. But I think that the question that I would say to ask would be, you know, are you living the life you intended? Right. And that's just like, I ask myself that. And I think that's something that's good to, for the listeners to consider and to look at, or are you living a life expected of you or what other people, are wanting for you? Even when you were talking about, the doctor, one of the, I have a friend of mine who's been an MD for a long time, and she was writing a book and she couldn't think about what the title would be. And I actually came up with the title for her, which is How Healthy is Your Doctor? Right. So many times we see the credentials, right? But he steps out of the office, he or she, and, they're smoking a pack of cigarettes or they're, 50 pounds overweight or whatever. And I'm like, you know what? That's a physician that has book knowledge, but they haven't incorporated the knowing of how to actually figure out how to be well. And so I feel like there's so many things that are out there that are coming from a place of sickness and not well and fear. And so I really kind of look at, how is it that how are you owning your own power? I mean, that's the main question of how are you owning your own power? I mean, get all the knowledge and information that's out there, but when it comes down to it, run it through your internal filter. I mean, that's part of your God-given ability is to be able to intuit something, to discern, to know what is good for you. And the more you leave that for other people to do, the more out of touch you get with that skill that you were actually born with. And I think that's one of the most important things to ask is where are you giving that power away and how are you actually standing in that power?
That's awesome. I really enjoy that. That's a great closing point. And just because I'm a narcissist and I always have to get in the last word. That's so funny. Talk about the doctor that walks out 50 pounds overweight. I'm kind of a slow guy. I can run for really long distances and hike for a really long time, but I'm really slow. And when I see a cop or a sheriff who I'm like, there's no cop who I should be able to outrun, period. Because I am not a fast sprinter. And it's like,
I agree.
If you're in a job where you're supposed to catch criminals and you're supposed to be physically fit and you might have to hold me down in a violent situation, like there should be no cop in the world who I can outrun. And when I see just like these morbidly obese guys on the LAPD, I'm like, what happened, man? Like what went wrong? So I love that you brought up the story about the doctor that's not taking care of their own health. So, hey, thank you so much for being on. I know you got another interview coming up. We'll send you all the information. I'll start an email chain with us and our awesome sound producer here, Chris, so we can get any other takeaways. And then this will be out in a couple of weeks. And I'm so looking forward to putting our conversation out there to the masses.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott, so much, and be willing to having the conversation.
Thanks, Diane. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.